The morning of May 21st, 1940, arrived with a deceptive quietness over the French countryside near Arras. A thin mist clung to the fields, softening the edges of hedgerows and farmhouses that had stood for centuries. Birds sang their usual dawn chorus, unaware that this day would be marked by steel, fire, and one man's impossible stand against an armored tide. Private William Bill Henderson of the British Expeditionary Force sat in a shallow foxhole, his fingers running along the worn stock of his boy's anti-tank rifle. The weapon was already considered outdated by many in the British Army. At nearly 6 feet long and weighing over 36 pounds, it was a cumbersome beast that kicked like an angry mule when fired. Its .395 caliber rounds could penetrate the armor of early war tanks, but against the newer German panzers appearing on the battlefield, its effectiveness was increasingly questionable. Yet here Bill was, assigned to this position with this rifle, tasked with covering a crucial crossroads that led directly to the British lines. His orders were simple: delay any enemy advance long enough for the main force to establish defensive positions 3 miles back. Simple orders, perhaps, but the weight of them pressed on his chest, heavier than the rifle in his hands. Bill was 23 years old, a farmer's son from Somerset who had joined up the previous September when war was declared. He'd never imagined himself a soldier. His hands were made for plowing fields and mending fences, not holding instruments of conflict. But war doesn't ask for preferences. It takes what it needs and shapes men into whatever the moment requires. The mist began to lift as the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning's veil. Bill adjusted his position, wincing as his back protested against the cramped quarters of his foxhole. He'd dug it himself the previous evening, working until his hands blistered and his shoulders screamed. But he'd made it deep enough to provide good cover, and positioned it behind a thick hedgerow that would help conceal his location. His companion, Private James Fletcher, sat in a foxhole 20 yards to his left. Fletcher was older, 32, with a wife and 2 children back in Manchester. They'd shared stories the night before, passing cigarettes back and forth as they took turns on watch. Fletcher had shown Bill photographs of his daughters, their smiling faces seeming impossibly innocent against the backdrop of their current reality. The morning wore on with agonizing slowness. Bill ate a cold breakfast of tinned beef and hard biscuits, washing it down with lukewarm tea from his canteen. Every sound made him tense. Every distant rumble could be the approach of enemy armor. But hour after hour passed with nothing but the wind rustling through the grass and the occasional bird call. Then, at precisely 11:47 in the morning, the earth began to tremble. It started as a barely perceptible vibration. Something felt more than heard. But within seconds, it grew into an unmistakable rumbling that made the dirt walls of Bill's foxhole shake. He grabbed his binoculars and trained them on the road that emerged from a distant tree line about 800 yards away. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. Tanks, dozens of them, Panzer IIIs and IVs, their gray hulls adorned with the stark black and white crosses of the Wehrmacht. They moved in a loose column, engines roaring, tracks chewing up the road beneath them. Behind them came trucks loaded with infantry and more armor still emerging from the trees. Bill's hands trembled as he lowered the binoculars. His mouth went dry. He'd been told to expect enemy reconnaissance units, perhaps a few armored cars or light tanks, but this was a full mechanized column, easily 50 or more armored vehicles with supporting infantry that could number in the hundreds. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to fall back, to abandon this position and save himself. 2 men with anti-tank rifles against such a force was beyond foolish. It was a death sentence. But his orders echoed in his mind. Hold this position. Delay the enemy. Buy time for the main force. He looked over at Fletcher, who had also spotted the approaching column. Their eyes met across the distance. Fletcher's face was pale, but he gave Bill a slight nod. They both knew what had to be done. Bill settled into position behind his boy's rifle, his heart hammering against his ribs. The weapon's bipod was firmly planted in the dirt. He loaded a 5-round magazine, his hand steadier now that action was imminent. Strange how fear could paralyze you one moment and sharpen your focus the next. The German column was moving at a steady pace, perhaps 15 miles per hour, confident in their overwhelming strength. Why wouldn't they be? They'd smashed through French and British defenses for days now, their blitzkrieg tactics proving devastatingly effective. They probably expected this road to be clear, another easy mile toward the Channel ports where the British Expeditionary Force was desperately trying to evacuate. Bill waited until the lead tank was 600 yards away. His training instructor's voice echoed in his memory. Wait for a clear shot. Aim for weak points. Tracks, vision ports, engine compartments, make every round count. The lead Panzer III rumbled closer. 500 yards, 400. Bill could see the commander standing in the turret hatch, surveying the peaceful countryside ahead. The man probably thought this would be an uneventful drive. 300 yards. Bill exhaled slowly, letting his breathing steady. He aligned the sights, aiming for the tank's left track assembly. His finger curled around the trigger. The world seemed to narrow to just this moment, this shot, this one chance to do something that mattered. He fired. The boy's rifle roared like a cannon, its massive recoil slamming back into Bill's shoulder with brutal force. The muzzle blast kicked up dirt and debris around his position. Through the dust and smoke, he saw his round strike home. The armor-piercing bullet hit the left track of the lead Panzer III, and while it didn't penetrate the tank itself, it severed several track links. The tank lurched to a stop, its damaged track flailing uselessly. The commander disappeared into the turret, hatches slamming shut as the crew went on alert. Behind the disabled tank, the entire column ground to a halt, bunching up on the narrow road. Bill was already working the bolt action, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. To his left, Fletcher opened fire on the second tank in line. The crack of his boy's rifle echoed across the field. The German response was immediate and overwhelming. Machine gun fire erupted from multiple tanks, tracers arcing toward the British positions. The air filled with the angry buzz of bullets cutting through grass and hedgerow. Bill pressed himself deeper into his foxhole as rounds cracked overhead. But he wasn't done. He rose back into firing position, ignoring the bullets that snapped past his head. The second tank had moved off the road, trying to flank around the disabled lead vehicle. Bill tracked it, leading his target slightly, and fired again. This time, his round struck the tank's side skirt armor. It didn't penetrate, but the impact was visible, a bright spark against gray steel. The Panzer's turret began to traverse toward his position. Bill ducked as the tank's main gun fired, the shell screaming overhead and detonating somewhere behind him. The explosion showered him with dirt and debris. Fletcher kept firing, methodically working through his ammunition. One of his rounds found a lucky hit, penetrating the vision port of a Panzer IV. The tank stopped immediately, smoke beginning to pour from its hatches as the crew bailed out. But for every tank they damaged or disabled, 10 more pushed forward. The German infantry was dismounting from their trucks, spreading out into the fields on either side of the road. Mortar teams were setting up, and soon high-explosive rounds began falling around the British positions. Bill reloaded his rifle, his hands moving automatically despite the chaos around him. Mortar fragments whined through the air. Machine gun fire never ceased. The ground itself seemed to shake, with the combined roar of dozens of tank engines all revving at high speed. A Panzer III broke through the hedgerow only 70 yards from Bill's position. He swung his rifle around, no time for careful aim, and fired at the tank's side. The round ricocheted off the armor, but the impact caused the tank to stop momentarily, its commander uncertain about what other obstacles might be hidden in this field. That moment of hesitation was exactly what Bill needed. He worked his rifle's bolt, chambered another round, and this time aimed carefully for the tank's engine deck. He fired. The round punched through the thinner rear armor, and something critical failed inside the engine compartment. Black smoke began pouring from the tank's rear. Fletcher was still fighting from his position, though Bill could see that his foxhole had taken several direct hits from small arms fire. The earth around it was churned up from bullet impacts and shell fragments. The battle had been raging for only 7 minutes, but it felt like hours. Bill's shoulder was a mass of bruises from his rifle's recoil. His ears rang from the constant gunfire and explosions. Cordite smoke burned his lungs with every breath. The Germans were now fully deployed, infantry advancing in organized squads while tanks provided covering fire. Bill could see enemy soldiers moving through the fields, using the terrain for cover, working their way closer to his position. It was a textbook combined arms assault, executed with the efficiency that had made the Wehrmacht so feared. Bill knew he couldn't stop them. That was never the point. But every minute he held them here was another minute for his comrades to dig in 3 miles back. Every tank he disabled was one less threat his regiment would face later. Every German soldier who had to take cover, who had to slow down and assess the situation, bought precious time. He fired again, his round striking the turret of a Panzer III. The impact left a bright scar on the armor but didn't penetrate. The tank's machine gun swiveled toward him, and Bill dropped into his foxhole as bullets chewed up the hedgerow above him. Fletcher shouted something, but Bill couldn't hear it over the din of battle. He risked a glance and saw his companion pointing urgently toward the right flank. 3 panzers had swung wide, trying to envelope their positions. Behind them came infantry, at least a full platoon, moving with practiced efficiency. Bill traversed his rifle towards this new threat. He aimed at the lead tank's tracks and fired. The round struck home, and the tracks separated with a metallic snap that was somehow audible even over all the other noise. The tank slewed to a stop, its remaining track digging uselessly into the soft earth. But the other 2 tanks kept coming, and the infantry was closing fast. Bill could see their faces now, young men not much different from himself, following orders, doing their duty. In another time, another place, some of them might have been friends. He reloaded and fired at the 2nd tank. This time his aim was off, the round sailing past the Panzer and striking the ground beyond. He worked the bolt, hands moving with desperate speed, and fired again. This round hit the tank's side armor at an angle and glanced off harmlessly. Fletcher's rifle cracked again, and one of the approaching infantry soldiers went down, clutching his leg. The others dove for cover, their advance momentarily halted. Bill knew they were out of time. The flanking force was almost on top of them, and more German infantry was closing from the front. Mortar fire was becoming more accurate, shells dropping closer with each salvo. He'd done what he could. He'd held them for nearly 12 minutes now, damaged or disabled at least 8 tanks, and caused the entire column to deploy into attack formation rather than just rolling through unopposed. A mortar round exploded 5 yards from Fletcher's position. Bill saw his companion thrown violently against the wall of his foxhole. Fletcher struggled to sit up, blood streaming down the side of his face. Bill made a decision. He fired his remaining rounds as fast as he could work the bolt, not aiming carefully anymore, just putting steel downrange to keep the enemy's heads down. Then he scrambled out of his foxhole and sprinted toward Fletcher's position, zigzagging as machine gun fire kicked up dirt around his feet. He dove into Fletcher's foxhole and landed hard. Fletcher was conscious but dazed, one arm hanging uselessly at his side. Bill grabbed him by his webbing and started pulling him up. "Leave me," Fletcher gasped. "Get yourself out." "Not a chance," Bill replied. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant and calm, despite the terror coursing through him. He hauled Fletcher to his feet, supporting the older man's weight. They stumbled away from their positions, staying low, using every bit of cover they could find. Behind them, German infantry was overrunning their foxholes, finding them empty. A Panzer III's turret swung toward them. Bill saw the muzzle flash and threw himself and Fletcher down just as the shell screamed overhead. They crawled through a gap in a hedgerow, thorns tearing at their uniforms, and then they were running again, stumbling across an open field toward a line of trees. Bullets whipped through the air around them. Bill felt something tug at his sleeve, felt the burn of a near miss across his ribs. But he kept running, half carrying Fletcher, driven by nothing but the desperate animal need to survive. They made it to the tree line and collapsed behind a fallen log. Bill's lungs felt like they were on fire. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. Fletcher was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and rapid. Bill allowed himself 1 minute to catch his breath, then started pulling Fletcher deeper into the woods. He could hear German voices behind them, the sound of tanks crushing through the hedgerows they'd just escaped. But the enemy was moving cautiously now, wary of more resistance. For the next 3 hours, Bill dragged, carried, and encouraged Fletcher through those woods. They moved slowly, stopping frequently to hide as German patrols passed nearby. Fletcher's condition worsened, but he never complained, never gave up. Finally, as the sun was beginning to set, they stumbled across a British picket line. Soldiers rushed forward to help them, and Bill's legs finally gave out. He collapsed, Fletcher still in his arms, both of them covered in blood, dirt, and the residue of battle. A lieutenant crouched beside them, his face grim. "What unit are you from?" Bill told him, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were at the crossroads?" the lieutenant asked, disbelief evident in his tone. "We heard the fighting. Command thought you were overrun immediately." "We held," Bill managed to say. 14 minutes. Disabled 8, maybe 9 tanks. Slowed them down." The lieutenant nodded slowly, something like awe crossing his features. "You gave us time to establish positions. The Germans hit us at full strength an hour ago, but we were ready. We held the line." Medical orderlies were loading Fletcher onto a stretcher. Someone draped a blanket over Bill's shoulders. He sat there, too exhausted to move, and watched as darkness fell over the French countryside. The full scope of what Bill Henderson had accomplished wouldn't be clear until days later, when after-action reports were compiled and intelligence assessed. His 14-minute stand at that crossroads, armed with nothing but an obsolete anti-tank rifle and sheer determination, had delayed an entire German mechanized column. The 50-plus tanks and supporting infantry had been forced to deploy into full combat formation, something that took time and coordination. The temporary loss of several tanks to damage had created confusion and caution. The German commanders, expecting light resistance at most, had suddenly faced what appeared to be a prepared defensive position. This delay, combined with similar actions by other small British units across the region, bought crucial hours for the establishment of defensive lines that would help facilitate the eventual evacuation at Dunkirk. While Bill couldn't have known it at the time, his actions that day were part of a larger tapestry of small heroics that prevented total catastrophe. Fletcher survived his wounds, though he never returned to combat. He was evacuated to England, where he reunited with his wife and daughters. He would carry shrapnel in his back for the rest of his life, and nightmares about that day for even longer. But he lived, and that mattered. Bill Henderson was recommended for the military medal for his actions. The citation read, in the understated language typical of military awards, for gallantry and determination in the face of overwhelming odds, maintaining his position under heavy fire, and inflicting significant casualties on the enemy. But decorations and citations couldn't capture what really happened in that field on May 21, 1940. They couldn't describe the terror, the moment-to-moment decisions between duty and survival, the weight of that obsolete rifle in shaking hands, or the sound of 50 tank engines bearing down on a single soldier in a foxhole. The boy's anti-tank rifle would continue to see service throughout the war, though it was increasingly recognized as inadequate against modern armor. Better weapons were developed, more effective tactics were implemented. The rifle became a footnote in military history, remembered mainly by collectors and enthusiasts. But for 14 minutes on a spring morning in France, in the hands of a 23-year-old farmer's son who had never wanted to be a soldier, that obsolete rifle was enough. It was enough to make a difference. It was enough to buy time. It was enough to save lives. Bill returned to England with the rest of the British Expeditionary Force. He survived the war, though he never spoke much about his experience at that crossroads. When asked, he would simply say he'd done his duty, nothing more. Those who knew him well recognized the cost behind those simple words, the nightmares, the way loud noises made him flinch, the distant look that would sometimes come over him as if he were hearing those tank engines again. He returned to Somerset after the war and took over his father's farm. He married a local girl named Margaret who had worked in a munitions factory during the war. They had 3 children together. Bill taught them to work the land, to respect the cycle of seasons, to understand that life is precious and fragile. On the mantelpiece in their farmhouse, Bill kept a single photograph from the war. It showed him and Fletcher, taken just days before that fateful battle. 2 young men in ill-fitting uniforms, trying to smile despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. Bill never explained the photo to his children when they were young. It was only when they were older, when they began to understand the weight of history, that he told them the story. Fletcher visited the Henderson farm once, in the summer of 1962. The 2 men walked through the fields together, talking quietly about things only they could understand. They never met again after that, but they exchanged letters every Christmas until Fletcher passed away in 1979. The battlefield where Bill made his stand has changed little over the decades. The crossroads still exists, though it's now paved and sees regular traffic. The fields have been farmed, replanted, harvested countless times. Nature has healed the scars left by tank tracks and shell craters. There's a small memorial there now, erected by local historians who researched the battle. It's a simple stone marker that reads, "Here on 21st May 1940, soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force delayed the German advance, buying precious time during the Battle of France." It doesn't mention Bill Henderson by name. It doesn't describe the obsolete rifle or the 14 minutes of impossible resistance. But those who study military history know the stories behind such memorials. They understand that wars are decided not just by grand strategies and massed armies, but by individual moments of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The boy's anti-tank rifle that Bill used that day was never recovered. It was left behind in the retreat, one of countless pieces of equipment abandoned during the evacuation. Perhaps it was picked up by German forces as a war trophy. Perhaps it was destroyed or discarded. Or perhaps it still lies buried somewhere in those French fields, a rusting reminder of a desperate morning when one man's determination proved more powerful than 50 tons of steel. Military historians and armchair generals have debated Bill's decision to stand and fight. Some argue he should have withdrawn immediately upon seeing the size of the enemy force. Others point out that his resistance, however brief, achieved exactly what was needed. The debate misses the point. Bill Henderson wasn't thinking about military theory or historical analysis when he made his choice. He was thinking about the men 3 miles back who needed time. He was thinking about Fletcher beside him. He was thinking about doing his duty, even when that duty seemed impossible. The German commanders who led that column likely never knew the full story of the resistance they encountered. Their reports probably noted unexpected opposition at the crossroads, some casualties and damaged vehicles. A brief delay before the advance continued. They wouldn't have known it was essentially 2 men with obsolete rifles. If they had, would they have been impressed? Frustrated? Would they have recognized the courage it took to stand against such overwhelming force? War creates these strange moments, these intersections where individual human will collides with the machinery of organized violence. Bill Henderson found himself at one such intersection, armed with a weapon that military progress had left behind, facing an enemy force that represented the cutting edge of modern warfare. The irony isn't lost on historians. The newest, most advanced tanks of their day, symbols of mechanical progress and military might, were held at bay, however briefly, by a weapon already considered obsolete. It's a reminder that wars are ultimately fought by human beings, and that courage, determination, and tactical skill can sometimes overcome technological disadvantages. This isn't to romanticize war or suggest that outdated equipment is somehow preferable. Far from it. Better weapons, better training, better support would have made Bill's job easier and safer. But when the moment comes, when history demands action, soldiers work with what they have. And sometimes, what they have is enough. Bill's story spread quietly through military circles after the war. It was never widely publicized, never became the subject of major films or books, but it was told in training schools, used as an example of leadership, initiative, and refusing to give up even when the situation seems hopeless. Young officers learning about defensive operations would hear about the soldier who held a crossroads with an obsolete rifle. The details might vary slightly in the telling, as all stories do, but the core message remained consistent. Determination and tactical skill matter. Individual actions can make a difference. Never give up. Margaret Henderson knew parts of the story, gleaned from the nightmares Bill sometimes had, from the way he would occasionally stare at the horizon as if seeing something she couldn't. She never pushed him to talk about it. She understood that some experiences leave marks too deep for words. Their children grew up on that Somerset farm, learning the rhythms of agricultural life. Bill taught them to shoot, but he never told them war stories when they were young. He wanted them to understand that weapons were tools, not toys, to be respected but never glorified. It was only when his eldest son, Thomas, came home from national service in 1959 that Bill finally spoke in detail about that day at the crossroads. Father and son sat up late one night, and Bill told the story from beginning to end. Thomas listened in silence, beginning to understand the quiet strength his father had always possessed. The physical scars from that day faded over time. The bruising on Bill's shoulder eventually healed. The shallow cut across his ribs became just another mark on a body that knew hard physical labor. But the internal scars remained, invisible reminders of those 14 minutes when the world narrowed to a rifle sight, a trigger, and the determination to hold just a little longer. Fletcher's daughters never fully understood what their father and Bill had endured together. How could they? They'd been children when the war began, sheltered as much as possible from its horrors. By the time they were old enough to ask questions, their father had learned to redirect conversations, to give vague answers that satisfied curiosity without revealing the depth of trauma he carried. But those two men, separated by hundreds of miles, connected by one shared experience, understood each other perfectly. Their annual Christmas letters were brief, often talking about weather and family and ordinary things. But between the lines ran a current of recognition. We were there. We survived. We did what needed doing. The tactical lessons from Bill's stand were studied and incorporated into British defensive doctrine. The importance of determined resistance, even by small units, was emphasized. The psychological impact on an advancing enemy of encountering unexpected resistance was noted. Future generations of soldiers would benefit from the lessons learned in that French field. But doctrine and tactics don't capture the human reality. They don't describe the taste of fear, the weight of responsibility, the moment of decision when everything hangs in balance. They don't talk about the shaking hands that somehow manage to steady enough to aim, or the voice in your head screaming to run while another voice, quieter but more insistent, says, "Hold." Bill Henderson lived to be 73 years old. He passed away in 1990, surrounded by his family in the same farmhouse where he'd been born. His funeral was well attended by neighbors, friends, and the community that had known him all his life. The vicar mentioned, briefly, Bill's military service, noting simply that he'd served his country with distinction during the war. Among the mourners were two elderly men wearing berets marked with military insignia. They'd served in Bill's regiment, though in different companies, and they'd heard the story of the crossroads. They came to pay their respects to a man who exemplified what it meant to be a soldier, doing your duty, protecting your comrades, holding the line when holding seemed impossible. Fletcher had passed away 11 years earlier, but his eldest daughter attended the funeral. She brought with her the photograph that had sat on her father's mantelpiece for decades, two young soldiers trying to smile for the camera. She gave it to Thomas Henderson, saying simply, "Your father saved my father's life. He should be remembered." The photograph now sits in the Imperial War Museum in London, part of a small exhibit on the Battle of France. The caption identifies the subjects as Private William Henderson and Private James Fletcher, British Expeditionary Force, May 1940. It mentions in brief their action at an unnamed crossroads that helped delay the German advance. Visitors walk past it daily, most giving it only a glance. It's just another wartime photograph among thousands, just another story among millions. But some pause, some read the caption more carefully, and they begin to understand. This was real. These were real people, as real as anyone, who found themselves in circumstances they never chose and rose to meet them. The boy's anti-tank rifle is well represented in military museums across Britain and the Commonwealth. Visitors can see the weapon's impressive size, read about its specifications and service history. Plaques explain its role in the early war years, how it was eventually superseded by more effective weapons, how it became a symbol of Britain's desperate improvisation in the face of German mechanized warfare. But no museum display can truly convey what it was like to fire that rifle in combat. The brutal recoil that could dislocate an unprepared shooter's shoulder, the deafening roar of its discharge, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the desperate hope that this shot, this one shot, might make a difference. Those things can only be understood by those who were there, and their numbers dwindle with each passing year. The crossroads in France sees little traffic these days. The road that once carried German panzers toward the Channel now serves local farmers and the occasional tourist. The fields that once echoed with gunfire and explosions now grow wheat and barley under peaceful skies. On certain quiet mornings, when the mist hangs low and the world is still, it's possible to stand there and imagine what it must have been like. To picture the tanks emerging from the tree line, to hear in your mind's ear the distinctive crack of an anti-tank rifle. To understand, however imperfectly, what it meant to be a young man in a foxhole, with only an obsolete weapon, and his courage to hold back an army. War continues to change. Technology advances. New weapons replace old ones. Tactics evolve. But some things remain constant. The courage required to stand and fight, the bonds formed between soldiers, the weight of duty, and the price of sacrifice. Bill Henderson's story reminds us of these constants. It shows us that historical moments are made of individual decisions, that grand narratives are built from countless small acts of bravery, that the course of events can be altered by one person refusing to yield. The boy's anti-tank rifle was obsolete by the standards of 1940. Against the armor of modern panzers, it was woefully inadequate. Military planners knew this. Soldiers knew this. But knowing a weapon is obsolete and abandoning your position are two different things. Bill Henderson didn't abandon his position. He didn't calculate the odds and decide the situation was hopeless. He saw what needed to be done, and he did it, with the tools he had available, for as long as he could hold out. And in doing so, he became part of something larger than himself, part of the story of how Britain survived its darkest hour. The 14 minutes Bill held that crossroads were 14 minutes that British forces didn't have to give up. 14 minutes to dig trenches deeper, to position machine guns more effectively, to prepare for the onslaught they knew was coming. In the grand scheme of the war, 14 minutes seems insignificant. But war is built of such minutes, accumulated and compounded, each one buying time, space, opportunity. Fletcher knew this. As he lay wounded in that foxhole, hearing Bill fire his last rounds, he understood what they'd accomplished. They hadn't won a battle. They'd barely even fought one by conventional standards, but they'd made a stand. They'd said to the enemy, "You will not pass here unopposed. You will pay a price for every yard." That message, repeated by thousands of soldiers in thousands of places, is what makes resistance possible. It's what turns a rout into a fighting retreat, what transforms desperation into determination. The memorial stone at the crossroads was placed there in 1985, 45 years after the battle. Bill attended the dedication ceremony, though he tried to avoid the attention. Local officials wanted to honor him specifically, but he refused, insisting that Fletcher and countless other unknown soldiers be remembered instead. He gave a brief speech at the ceremony, his voice quiet but steady. "We did what was asked of us, nothing more. Every man who stood and fought, who held the line when holding seemed impossible, deserves to be remembered. This stone honors all of them." Those who were there remarked on his humility, his reluctance to accept special recognition. But those who understood military service recognized something else: survivor's guilt. The weight of knowing you lived when so many didn't. The question that haunts veterans, why me? Why was I spared when others weren't? Bill never found a satisfying answer to that question. He lived with it, carried it like he'd once carried Fletcher through those woods, and did his best to honor the sacrifice of those who didn't come home by living a good life, raising his family, being a productive member of his community. The Somerset farm thrived under his stewardship. He introduced modern farming techniques while respecting the land and its limits. He taught his children the value of hard work and the importance of perseverance. And on quiet evenings, sitting on his porch watching the sunset, he sometimes thought about that morning in France. He thought about the weight of the rifle in his hands, the sound of tank engines, the fear that threatened to overwhelm him, and the strange calm that came over him when he made the decision to stand and fight. That calm had sustained him through those 14 minutes and through all the years that followed. War has a way of revealing who people truly are. It strips away pretense and forces choices that define character. Bill Henderson was revealed as a man of quiet courage, someone who could face overwhelming odds without flinching, who would risk everything for his comrades and his duty. But he would have said that the war didn't change him. It simply put him in circumstances where his character was tested. He was still the same Somerset farm boy he'd always been, the same person who valued loyalty, hard work, and doing right by others. The war just gave him a stage where those values had life or death consequences. The last letter Fletcher wrote to Bill shortly before his death in 1979 contained a simple sentence that Bill kept folded in his wallet for the rest of his life. "You saved me that day, but I want you to know that your friendship saved me every day after." Those words meant more to Bill than any medal or commendation. They represented the true measure of what they'd accomplished together, not just surviving a battle, but maintaining their humanity through it, refusing to let the experience destroy who they were. As the years passed and Bill grew older, the physical reminders of that day faded. His hearing, damaged by the concussive blasts of shells and gunfire, gradually worsened. His shoulder, repeatedly bruised by the rifle's recoil, developed arthritis, but his memories remained sharp, perhaps too sharp, bringing with them both pride and pain. He watched the world change around him. He saw new conflicts arise, new weapons developed, new tactics employed. He read about modern warfare with its precision-guided munitions and advanced technology, and he recognized both progress and continuity. The tools changed, but the fundamental nature of combat remained. Human beings in desperate circumstances, trying to survive, trying to complete their mission, trying to protect their comrades. The obsolete boy's rifle that Bill used has become a collector's item now, sought after by military history enthusiasts and museums. Original examples in good condition are rare and valuable, but their true value can't be measured in money. They represent a specific moment in history, a time when Britain stood virtually alone against a seemingly unstoppable enemy, when improvisation and determination had to compensate for material shortcomings. Bill's grandchildren grew up hearing edited versions of their grandfather's war story. As they got older, they began to understand the gaps in the narrative, the parts left unsaid. They learned to recognize the faraway look that sometimes came over him, the way he would pause mid-sentence, as if listening to sounds only he could hear. One of his grandsons, James, named after Fletcher, became a military historian. He wrote his doctoral thesis on small unit actions during the Battle of France, using his grandfather's experience as one of several case studies. It was through this research that the full tactical significance of Bill's stand became clear. The ripple effects of that 14-minute delay, how it contributed to the successful establishment of defensive lines that helped thousands of soldiers reach the evacuation beaches at Dunkirk. James showed Bill the thesis, seeking his approval and input. Bill read it carefully, making few corrections, but adding small details that brought the account to life. The smell of spring flowers mixing with cordite smoke, the way his hands trembled as he loaded each magazine, the strange clarity that came over him once the fighting started. "You make it sound heroic," Bill said when he finished reading. "It didn't feel heroic, it felt necessary." That distinction mattered to him. Heroism implies something extraordinary, something beyond normal human capacity. But Bill saw his actions as simply doing what the situation required. Any soldier in his position would have done the same, he insisted. The fact that circumstances forced him into that position didn't make him special. But history disagrees with that assessment. Not every soldier would have held that position. Not every soldier would have continued fighting against such overwhelming odds. Not every soldier would have risked his life to save a wounded comrade during the retreat. These were choices, and choices reveal character. The military continued to evolve after World War II. Anti-tank weapons became more sophisticated. Tactics adapted to counter improved armor. The lessons learned from thousands of small actions like Bill's were incorporated into training and doctrine. Future generations of soldiers benefited from the hard-won knowledge purchased with blood and courage in places like that French crossroads. But one lesson remained constant, taught in every military academy and training camp. Never give up. Hold your position until ordered to withdraw. Your actions, however small they seem, contribute to the larger mission. Your courage inspires others. Your determination makes a difference. Bill Henderson embodied that lesson. He didn't need anyone to teach it to him. It was simply part of who he was. When the moment came, when history demanded his response, he gave it without hesitation or complaint. On his 73rd birthday, just months before he passed away, Bill's family gathered for a celebration at the farm. His children and grandchildren were there, along with neighbors and friends. Someone asked him, as people often did, what he considered his greatest accomplishment. Everyone expected him to mention the farm, which he'd built into a successful operation, or his family of whom he was justly proud, or perhaps his military service, which had earned him decorations and respect. But Bill thought for a long moment before answering. "I kept Fletcher alive," he said finally. "Everything else, the farm, the family, all of it built on that foundation. I kept my mate alive when it mattered most." It was a soldier's answer, reflecting a soldier's priorities. Your comrades first, your mission second, yourself last. That hierarchy of values, learned in training and proven in combat, had guided Bill through those terrible 14 minutes and through all the years that followed. Fletcher's daughter, who had traveled from Manchester for the celebration, heard this answer and wept. She'd brought her own children, Fletcher's grandchildren, who had never met the man who had saved their grandfather's life. Now they stood before him, this elderly farmer with weathered hands and kind eyes, and began to understand the weight of the debt their family owed. But Bill wouldn't hear to talk of debts. "We looked after each other," he insisted. "That's what mates do. No one owes anyone anything." This, too, was part of his character, the refusal to hold his actions over others, to demand recognition or repayment. He'd done what needed doing, and that was enough. The fact that Fletcher lived to see his daughters grow up, to meet his grandchildren, to live a full life after the war, that was Bill's reward. He needed nothing more. As darkness fell that evening and the party wound down, Bill stood on his porch one last time, looking out over fields that had been in his family for generations, the land that had shaped him, that he'd returned to after the war, that had given him purpose and peace. Somewhere in France the sun was setting over fields that looked much the same as these, fields where, 50 years before, a young man had made a stand with an obsolete rifle and impossible odds. Fields that had witnessed courage and sacrifice and the stubborn refusal to yield that defines the best of human nature. Bill Henderson died 3 months later, peacefully, in his sleep. His last words to Margaret, spoken the evening before, were simple. It was a good life, and it was. Despite the war, despite the nightmares, despite carrying the weight of terrible memories, Bill Henderson lived a good life. He'd done his duty, saved his comrade, raised his family, and worked his land. He'd been tested by history and found not wanting. The obsolete rifle he'd used is gone, lost to the chaos of war and retreat. But the story endures. It's told in military academies and history classes. It's referenced in books about the Battle of France and the evacuation at Dunkirk. It's whispered by soldiers who face their own impossible situations and need inspiration. Because that's what stories like this do. They remind us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but action despite fear. That obsolete weapons in determined hands can achieve what should be impossible. That 14 minutes of resistance can ripple through history, affecting events far beyond what one man in one foxhole could ever imagine. The crossroads still stands in France, marked by its simple memorial stone. The fields have been replanted countless times. The hedgerows have grown and been trimmed back. The world has moved on as it always does. But on quiet mornings, when mist hangs low over those fields, perhaps Bill Henderson's ghost stands watch there still. A young man with an obsolete rifle, steady hands, and the courage to hold when holding seemed impossible. A reminder of what one person can do when history demands action and they refuse to yield. And perhaps, if you listen carefully on such mornings, you can hear it. The distinctive crack of a boy's rifle, the defiant sound of resistance, the echo of a moment when one soldier's determination held back an army and bought the time needed for thousands to escape, to fight another day, to eventually prevail. That is the legacy of Bill Henderson. Not in monuments or medals, though those have their place, but in the simple fact that he stood when standing was needed, fought when fighting was required, and held the line when the line had to be held. With an obsolete rifle and impossible odds, one soldier made a difference. And that difference echoed through history, saving lives, inspiring courage, and reminding future generations that the worth of a weapon lies not in its specifications, but in the hands that wield it and the heart that refuses to surrender. That is the story of how one soldier's obsolete rifle held off an enemy's 50-tank assault. It's a story of courage, duty, and the indomitable human spirit. It's a story worth remembering, worth telling, worth honoring. And it's a story that will endure as long as people value bravery in the face of overwhelming odds, as long as we recognize that individual actions matter, and as long as we remember that sometimes, when everything is on the line, one person with an obsolete weapon and unshakable determination is all it takes to hold back an army and change the course of history.